Greetings, everyone. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm here in the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia, where I'm Director for Academic Affairs. And we are delighted to welcome you to the second of our series called Touchstones of Democracy, where we explore people, texts, moments, places that are crucial for understanding the history of democracy. And we're really delighted today to be able to host this conversation between Ada Ferrer of New York University and Jalane Schmidt here at University of Virginia. I'm just going to briefly introduce Jalane and then hand it over to her to guide our conversation today. Jalane Schmidt is an associate professor here in the religion department at UVA. She is the director of the Memory Project here at the Democracy Initiative and works on a wide range of topics in anthropology, the politics of memory. She's also a deep specialist in the history of Cuba, the author of a wonderful book called Cachita, Streets, the Virgin of Charity, Race and Revolution in Cuba, which explores the deep and long history of the figure of the Virgin in Cuban history. So she's really a perfect person to embark on this conversation and journey with us through Cuban history. Ada, we're so delighted to have you with us. Congratulations on the new book, and we hope you'll all go out and get it. It's called Cuba, An American History, and I'll turn it over now to Jalane to moderate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. I'm Jalane Schmidt. I'm a scholar of Cuban history and culture here at the University of Virginia, so it gives me special pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Democracy Dreams, José Marti and Cuba in the 19th century, with our guest, Ada Ferrer. So Dr. Ferrer is the Julius Silver Professor of History in Latin American and Caribbean history at New York University. She is a historian of Cuba whose research and books have garnered many awards. Her first book, Cuba Insurgent, has been translated into Spanish and French. And her most recent work, as has been mentioned, we'll be discussing today. It's titled Cuba, An American History. And it's published by Scribner, which is an honor for a historian to have such a broad platform and a very well-deserved one, of course, too. It's a beautifully written book. Very nicely paced. It's quite a tome and would look quite intimidating, but she's just written it in such an engaging way that it just draws the reader through the text. And Cuba and American history is a comprehensive history of the island that spans from Columbus's encounter with Hatue up to the present day. And some of the threads, a consistent thread throughout the work, are the struggles for racial justice that have been waged in various eras of Cuban history. So we'll be sure to discuss this. And to kick off our discussion, Dr. Ferrer, I wanted to ask if you can explain to our audience kind of the meaning of the title of the work and why you've cast your sweeping account of Cuba as an American history.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jalane, for agreeing to have this conversation with me. It's an honor to discuss the book with you and to be here at UVA. So thank you for the invitation. So as you said, and as Laurent said, the title is Cuba and American History. And in some ways, the book could have been just Cuba, a history. But that seemed to me maybe a little flat, a little too closed and bounded. I feel like the US has been such a presence in Cuban history that any full history of Cuba is also a history of that American influence. So that's one reason the title fits. I thought but I think for me, the thing that drew me to that title even more was the fact that the US is in the world, right? The US has exerted enormous power in different parts of the world. So to study a place where that power has been so manifest and constant means that you are also studying American history, right? You're studying American history from the receiving end, from the outside in. And so I say how the book is also that, it's a history of Cuba, but it's also a kind of selective, necessarily incomplete history of the US, seen from Cuban waters, Cuban ground, and a history of kind of shadow history of the US. So that's another reason that I picked the title. And then finally, I think the title is a little mysterious, right? You read it and you think, what does that mean? Is it a diplomatic history of the two countries? Is it only a history of Cuba in relation to the US? Is it American, meaning Latin American, in the sense of José Marti, where all the where the word America does not belong just to the US, right? So, and I feel like that's also what drew me to the title, that the reader comes in not quite sure, their assumptions a little, on hold, suspended. And I like that. I like beginning from that place where the reader's not sure what to expect.
Great, yeah. So you mentioned Jose's invoking of Nuestra America, our America. And what was his, in talking about this, the Americas, in the plural and being, kind of the New World. How does he talk about the Americas in his sense of kind of in the hemispheric sense, in relationship to what became the American Empire by United States? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, José Marti is, I say in the book at several points that José Marti is the most famous Cuban after Fidel Castro, right? Like, he's just an incredibly important figure for Cuban history that many Americans aren't aware of, really. And so I think, just to remind people of who he was, he's a 19th century figure, born to Spanish parents in Havana. And he becomes, as a very young man, involved in the struggle for independence, in the struggle for Cuban independence against Spain. And to carry out that struggle, he has to leave Cuba, and he settles in New York City and spends most of his adult life actually in New York City. So he is a patriot. He's an activist for Cuban independence. He's also an immigrant struggling to live in New York through his writing. And he lived, by writing mostly. He wrote for Latin American newspapers primarily, and he wrote, poetry and plays and all kinds of things. He started a pro-independence newspaper called Patria in New York. He founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party in favor of Cuban and Puerto Rican independence in New York. So he did all that. And his writing, on the one hand, he writes a lot about the US, right? So he describes what he's seeing in New York, what he's reading in the newspapers that's happening across the country. He writes a lot about violence in the US against Native Americans, against immigrants, against African Americans. So he is, he's an outsider in New York who is describing American life. So he's an interesting chronicler. I sometimes think the most interesting descriptions of a place or a time come precisely from people such as him, who are in some way both inside and outside, and who are, incredibly smart. So one of the things that really calls his attention in living in the US is the way that people in the US talk about America as if America is only the US. And it makes him really angry sometimes. He rejects the kind of presumption of that position. And he tries to write about America more broadly and write about what he calls our America, meaning Latin America. And one of his most famous essays, certainly the most anthologized one, is called precisely that, Our America, Nuestra America. And the point of that essay is to celebrate the culture and history and heritage of Latin America, but also to warn against the presumptuous America, right? The US, which he says disdains Latin America, but is coveting it and poised to kind of try to engulf it. So I think, that essay and his work is always, it's multiple things at once. It's a celebration of Latin American culture, history, etc. But it's also this very perceptive warning about the danger of US empire.
Okay, great. And in one of his works, he used a phrase which I've heard repeated in many times in my own travels and study in Cuba. He describes himself, and he's living in the United States, as being in the entrails of the monster. You know, and what can you kind of elaborate a little bit more? You know, what is he saying here?
Yeah, so I think it's precisely the U.S. as as a power that is seeking to expand its power territorially, economically, politically, and so that's what he's referring to. He's in the U.S. He'll remark on things like street vendors selling newspapers and their chants and things like that. So it's daily life, but he's always aware that this country and this government is looking at other places as places to be colonized and brought under American influence. So he's referring to that in part, that what you might call that political greed or that territorial and economic greed of the US. But I think, if you read his writings, he also, he writes so much, and he writes so much about daily life, that I think there's a part of him that's writing about living as an immigrant in this country. And he says, living in this place is like living under a constant hail of blows. People are presumptuous. People just assume certain things about you. So he's also, it's a statement about the US's empire and the US power in the world. But I think it's also, on a deeper, more intimate level, a statement about himself as an immigrant in a place that's difficult and where you have to struggle to survive and to thrive. So I think it is also about that.
Okay, interesting. Now, of course, Martí dies before the conclusion of that ultimate third Cuban War of Independence, and yet he's writing about the entrails of the monster. He's pointing out kind of U.S. designs, on colonization. He's very prescient, of course, in saying this. He doesn't live to see the so-called American century, after 1898, when the U.S. becomes this empire. What were the cues that he was watching, that he saw, kind of almost, could foresee, this arc?
Yeah. So, I think he was a journalist, he was a scholar. I think he was very familiar with US history. So he knew the past, and it wasn't at that point even that distant a past, right? There had been American attempts to annex Cuba, and to acquire, either to buy it, to annex it by violence, to declare, even some rumors about declaring war on Spain. That had been going on since the 1820s. And in the 1850s, it was really powerful. So he knew that history. It wasn't that long ago. It was just 2 generations, ahead of time. So I think part of the cue was history itself. Part of the cue was, just seeing the growth of American power, and knowing that it was poised for more, and worrying that Cuba would be, not just Cuba, but all of Latin America would be next. So I think it was kind of, there were general cues as well, as he followed. Although he died in 1895. I was thinking of something that happened in 1897, but that wouldn't have been part of the cue. So, yeah.
So he's seeing that there might be danger ahead. He's, is warning his compatriots, about U.S. designs, on Cuba, and indeed the hemisphere. I mean, how does this affect his thinking about the prospects for independence, Cuban independence, and for democracy going forward, given that we have this, Cubans have this meddling neighbor.
Right, right. For him, it's a constant source of worry for him. So he spent so much of his life, so much of his time thinking about Cuban independence, about how it will be achieved and about what will it be. So he wasn't just thinking about the struggle against Spain. He was also thinking about the republic that would be formed after independence. And one of the phrases that's always associated with Marti, you mentioned before the belly of the monster. The other one is this phrase of, the republic by all and for all, la república de todos y para todos. And that was how he tried to imagine, post-independence Cuba as a republic in which that would be truly democratic. And he explicitly thought about it in terms of racial equality, racial, overcoming the legacies of racial slavery. Cuban slavery ended in 1886, right? The last war of independence begins in 1895. So it hasn't even been a full decade. And as he's writing about the coming war and advocating for it, he's also narrating and kind of presenting a history of the wars of independence that had already passed. And one of the things that he stressed was this idea that Black Cubans had fought for Cuban independence. And there is this kind of notion in Cuban history going back to the, practically to the period of the Haitian Revolution, that it held that Cuba would not be able to win its independence because if there would be any kind of struggle for independence would become a social revolution, and enslaved people and Black Cubans would become ascendant. That kind of language was already used, the language of race war, right? So in that old vision, Cuba's racial composition, Cuba's history of slavery incapacitated Cuba for nationhood, right? And what Martí said is, no, it's actually what the first independence war showed was that it's actually the opposite. Part of what will make Cuba a worthy republic is that white Cubans and Black Cubans fought together for Cuban independence. So he extolled this vision of a Cuban nationality that was built on a foundation of racial equality, right? And he thought of that as a gift to the world. Like he didn't just think about it as a Cuban future. He thought it could be a model for the world, I think. And I think part of that sense came from living in the US. And living in the US in the in the 1880s and early 1890s, where he saw racial violence and racial segregation hardening, with Jim Crow expanding, right? So in part, living in the US helps him see the value of a different kind of model that he hopes can take root in Cuba. Okay. So I think that's, so even thinking about what the Cuban Republic will be, what the Cuban Republic will be in terms of race and racial justice is something that's thought of in relation and in comparison to the US, right? So I think that's part of how he sees the relationship of the future of Cuba vis-a-vis the US. The other thing that he worries about, and I mentioned this before on a more practical level, is that once Cuban independence was achieved, he worried that would kind of open the door for the US government and American businessmen and others to kind of sweep down on Cuba. And in the last letter he wrote, the second to last letter he wrote before he died, that was the fear he expressed. I fear that all my work has been for Cuban independence, and that by achieving it, we might make possible this other nightmare, which is American expansion into Cuba, and then from Cuba into Latin America.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, and there were some of his Cuban compatriots that might have welcomed that.
Absolutely.
Incursion. And so there's this sense that there's several, probably more different constituencies, within the Cuban public. And I wonder, if you can kind of tease out, to kind of maybe, let's say 3 of them, like, some of these, wealthy planter types,
Yeah.
working folks, particularly, formerly enslaved, now freedmen. What's at stake for each of these constituents,
Yeah.
with independence, and how does Martí's vision speak to them or challenge these various constituencies?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's different constituencies, and Martí is very much aware of that. And he talks kind of derisively of compatriots that always wish there was a master, be the master Spanish or be the master American. There are people who will always prefer that there be a master rather than true Cuban independence. So he knew he was up against powers that be, both, in Spain, in the US, and in Cuba. In terms of it's interesting because in the first War of Independence, it's actually sugar planters who begin the first War of Independence in 1868 and initially liberate their own enslaved workers. But by 1895, the planters that are wealthier and that support, that are likelier to support either the continuation of Spanish rule or some kind of American rule, tend to be more in the center of the island. That's where the largest mechanized plantations are, and they are much less enamored of the idea of a republic for all, we should say. So in terms of the formerly enslaved, I think one of the most interesting groups that you see emerge in the final War of Independence is these young plantation workers, Black, sometimes 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, who when the Liberation Army comes through, they join the Liberation Army, the Independence Army, in droves. And they are mostly the sons born free to enslaved women. And there was a free womb law in Cuba in 1870. So a lot of them were born on the plantations to women who were enslaved, but they themselves were born free. And they are the bulk of the Liberation Army. And as well, and there are also, of course, formerly enslaved people. And I think for them, one of the things that the Independence War coming so soon after emancipation means that they are fighting, it's not just one fight, or it's not just one goal, right? They are fighting for Cuban independence, but that process is inseparable from the process of giving and making meaning out of their own freedom. So the struggle for freedom for Cuba becomes enmeshed with the struggle to make freedom from slavery real and meaningful. And that's why you get all these examples of people born, in the late 19th century who are Black or Afro-Cuban, taking on the last name Cuba as as their name, right? They're, they might not have had another apellido. They might only know their mother's name. They, on getting their freedom, they changed their name to Cuba, which I think is just, incredible. And I've seen it like looking at baptismal records in churches and, in Havana for this period.
Yeah, apellido truly of La Patria, for their last name. That's amazing.
Right.
So you're saying there's
African Americans. Sorry, it's like African Americans taking on the name Antonio Maceo, which is another, naming can be so interesting. Antonio Maceo, for those of you who don't know, is another major figure in the wars for Cuban independence. Since 1868, he was also killed in the final war, and he became the most prominent Afro-Cuban fighter for independence. And Americans follow his story, and African Americans follow his story. And so naming sons after Antonio Maceo, it becomes a clear pattern after, especially when, shortly before he died, and then after he died, people name their sons in his honor. Yeah.
Well, that's a nice segue to my next question, since we were just talking about the Bronze Titan himself. Mulatto, he would have been characterized as a mixed race human, Antonio Maceo. Can you say something, just, you were mentioning, these, freedmen, kind of the, sons of the free womb, as it were, who are
Yeah.
joining the Mambis, the independence fighters, as they're waging their military campaign in Cuba. Can you say something more about the connection between race, military service in the independence wars, and citizenship?
Yeah.
Conceptions of citizenship in the new republic, and then, and then I wonder, maybe a question for later on about what the U.S. might learn about democracy from Martí.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I mean, so Cuba, the independence war was waged by this rebel army, this independence army that was called, I mean, a name for them was the Mambises, but the formal name was the Ejército Libertador, the Liberation Army. And it had in the final war probably about 50,000 members. And, an incredible, really interesting force, thoroughly multiracial, multi-class, men of color ascended through its ranks to hold positions of power. So there were definitely people of color in the leadership ranks, but probably still the majority of like the generals and stuff would have been white. But an incredible army, it swept up many, as we were just talking about, formerly enslaved and people born free to enslaved mothers. No, we don't know what percentage of the army would have been considered Black, or would have considered themselves Black or mulatto or anything else, because the very extensive records for that army, excuse me, don't include racial identification. So the service records, which are incredible documents, include all kinds of details about them, where they were born, who their parents were, whether they could read and write, what battles they fought in, but it includes nothing about race. So we don't know with any certainty any kind of percentage, but we do know that it was significantly Black, and that for those fighters, they saw themselves as making the nation, and they saw their contribution as pivotal to gaining independence. And they presumed that participation in that army, in a movement that touted racial equality, would have translated into what Martí had called the Republic for All, where they would have the same access to jobs and rights and everything else as their white compatriots. When independence comes, it's a very strange independence, and it's part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason that it's strange is because the Americans intervene. So the US intervenes at the end of the final War of Independence, and what comes to be known as the Spanish-American War. Americans often don't realize that the Spanish-American War, which is, the US declared war on Spain, is, it's technically something like a 4-month war, right? But it was the last 4 months of a 30-year struggle for Cuban independence. And a lot of times Americans are completely, or tend to be unaware of that long 30-year history that preceded it. So the American intervention is part of what makes it this peculiar moment, peculiar independence, because they intervene and then they set up a military government of occupation. They try to limit the franchise. That doesn't quite happen the way that the Americans want. But in any case, Black veterans from the start are calling for their rights. And what their compatriots say is, wait, we got to let the Americans leave, because if there's trouble, they're never going to leave. So the Americans leave, but they're still not getting jobs, in government, in police, in civil service, etc. So right away, Black veterans point to the difficulties, the shallowness of citizenship compared to the promise of citizenship during the struggle. And that's one of the most, interesting and painful episodes of early Republican Cuban history, and it culminates in something called that came to be called the Race War of 1912, in which Black veterans have been advocating for their rights, demanding their rights, not getting anywhere, being told always to wait, not making any progress. And so they found a party called the Independent Party of Color. And then that party gets outlawed, it gets criminalized. They keep advocating to have it legalized and stage a protest on May 20th, 1912, that's brutally repressed, and thousands of people die. And it just, and it's, I call it in the book, perhaps the ugliest episode in Republican Cuban history, because what ends up happening is some of the veterans from that War of Independence make battle against the Black compatriots who were also veterans of the War of Independence, So I think it's important for people to realize that Martí's vision of this racially transcendent, racially equal republic was not a description of what he thought existed. Sometimes you talk about his vision and people think, well, that didn't exist. And he knows it didn't exist, but he saw it as a goal. He saw it as something that was necessary if Cuban independence, if Cuban democracy, if the Cuban Republic was going to be fully realized.
And, are Martí's writings, how are they circulating there? How widespread are they? Are his ideas about independence in the Republic, are these, kind of something that the broader public is grasping onto? Can you say just something about the media of transmission of these ideas?
Right.
And when do they kind of reach their ascendancy, I guess, Martí's ideas?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So if you read, war diaries and war memoirs, they are some of the, because he's writing in New York, he's not, but copies of that newspaper Patria, which is where he writes mostly about Cuban independence, are making it to Cuba, and they're circulating, and they're being excerpted in letters people receive. So sometimes you hear in the memoirs and diaries discussions among people in a military camp about Martí's ideas, but really they did not become prominent and well known until after his death. So media, the Spanish actually, they always limited and censored media. It became more open after 1878, but you still had problems of circulation and printing and so on. So they weren't that widely known. He became the apostle, after the fact, right? So people knew about him, but not, for example, in 1895, Antonio Maceo would have been much, much, much more famous than José Martí, right? So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting then, that it's posthumously that his ideas gain even more traction, it sounds like, in terms of at least he's invoked so many times, by early Republican leaders and even into the present day. I mean, there's this, he's such a touchstone.
Right. No, I mean, among the leadership of the movement, they know his work. They're reading his work. He's president of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, so he's obviously well known. But in terms of general widespread knowledge across the island, that comes after his death. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So there's hope for all of us then. Our words may
hopefully we
us.
won't have to die in battle, but yes.
Hopefully not.
Yeah.
Well, we're opening up a Q&A period now for our audience, and so we invite audience members who have questions for our guest to use the Zoom Q&A function to relay those questions to us. I'm seeing one question that came through here already. It's a really big question here. Is how has Cuba dealt with the legacy of slavery?
Yeah. Well, I would say not particularly well. I think in some sense, Martí's idea about Cuban nationality being racially transcendent in some sense. This idea that Cubans are more than Black or white, they're just Cuban, is still really powerful. And on the one hand, that is a vision for racial equality. But in practice, it can be used to stifle discussions about race. And historically, that has been as powerful as Martí's vision itself, if that makes sense. Like, it can be used in two ways, and both ways have had a lot of traction in Cuban history. So just to give you an example from the archives, when I first went to Cuba to start my dissertation research, whenever, 30 something, I don't know, whatever, 30 years ago, more than that. And I said, I want to work on, because I initially, when I first went to the archives, like for my first book, I said, I want to work on Black participation in the wars of independence. And the archivists were, well, you can't study that. You're not going to, basically, there were no Blacks or whites. There were only Cubans by that point. Or when I went to those service records and race was not recorded in the service records. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. And historians, Cuban historians and archivists would say to me, of course it makes sense. By then there were no Blacks and whites. There were only Cubans. So that frame can challenge, or can make it difficult to talk about race and slavery. The example I gave you was pretty benign, because I took what they said, I took it in, but I didn't believe it, and I kept looking for other ways to document it. But if it's against a Black veteran who's decrying discrimination, and then it's used to silence a group of Black veterans, then it has much more much more power. And that kind of has translated into discussions of slavery, where to bring up slavery is, it can be divisive. Slavery was also, it's all put in a national frame. Slavery was a Spanish institution, and it was challenged by the Cuban Independence movement that ended slavery. So in that view, the Cuban nation stands unproblematically against slavery. And to suggest otherwise is to be divisive, is to bring in race where it doesn't belong. All these kinds of arguments that are used against against the discussion of race. And if you talk to Cuban historians today, or to Cuban intellectuals, they will often tell you how little they learned about slavery in Cuba. So the story they learn about slavery is, they learn a little bit, but mostly they learn that it was abolished by the Cuban Independence movement. So they don't learn about the illegal slave trade, in which Cuban citizens were very implicated. They don't learn about how late the slave trade lasted to Cuba, and about what African societies are most closely linked to Cuba. So all that, there's a kind of dissatisfaction and disappointment with how little it has been really grappled with in terms of how, what legacies it has left, not just in terms of racism, but in terms of histories of wealth and inequality and structural racism and so on.
I also found that in my research there, that there was sometimes a disavowal that there was any problem there with race, because that had been solved, in this case, by the revolution, that the republic, it was the republic that had problems. There's always this deferral of,
exactly,
of responsibility to the prior regime, but everything's fine now, so go ahead.
No, there's a parallel too, whereas I think in the independence period, there was a vision of, like, because the independence movement tried to end slavery and ended it in rebel territory, this vision that the independence movement had brought Blacks into history. It had invited them into history. And for that, Black Cubans should be grateful, right? They should be grateful to the independence movement, grateful to the republic. There's a parallel in the period after the revolution of 1959, where if the problem was the republic, the 1959 revolution brought Blacks into history. It gave them equality, it gave them opportunity. And for that, they should be grateful, right?
And stop complaining.
You see that, yes, and you see that discourse playing out a lot in recent weeks and months. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. With the recent uprisings and
Yeah.
again, the
Yeah.
criticism that you're being divisive if you even bring this up
Yeah.
because we're all Cubans.
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
We've got a question here about from Carmen Lamas here from UVA. Might you speak to how the US-Mexico War of 1846 to 48 impacted the history of Cuba in relation to the US and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question. I talk a little bit about it in the book, but not nearly as much as I would have wanted to. And I think it's a great topic for people looking for research projects that combine US and Cuban history. So I would say two things about that. One is that, you know, American leaders and American statesmen imagined acquiring Cuba and annexing it to the US for a long, long time, right? Since the founding of the American Republic, that had been part of the vision. The acquisition of Texas makes Cuba seem like the automatic next step. So it's almost like you can see the acquisition of Texas and American ideas about Cuba as part of this same broad history of US expansionism, right? It's not just a continental story. And I think it's interesting to put both Mexico or Texas and Cuba in the same frame that way. So I think it says something about American expansionism and American empire. The other thing is that I think there's a really interesting story to be told there in terms of the illegal slave trade. You know, most of the slave trade is first illegalized in Cuba by the Spanish in 1820, but nobody pays attention. And most of the Africans who arrived to be enslaved in Cuba arrived after 1820, or after the slave trade became illegal. So Texas is linked to that story. So because the slave trade to Cuba continued long after the slave trade to the US, Americans went to Cuba and took captives to sell them in Texas. So I think there's a vibrant network of the illegal slave trade that involves, that has a node in Cuba. A node in Cuba, and then another node in Texas. And I would love for someone to write that book.
Yes, please, graduate students, anyone listening, this sounds like a topic that needs attention. That's amazing. We've got another question, since we were kind of talking about nation building. And this is an old saw, if you will, that's been brought up by Hannah Arendt and others, kind of blaming the quote unquote failure of revolutions in South America and the Caribbean in terms of their ability to have state building and stability on the absence of elected assemblies, that it existed in British North American colonies. And of course, here we are in Virginia, the home of the House of Burgesses, the oldest deliberative body, elected deliberative body. And so, might it be argued, and here we get back to, the thread through your work about, looking at race, could it be argued that race was the real obstacle, and that it was, often, kind of white compatriots there in Cuba and their willingness or unwillingness to share power. What's going on here, with respect to state building and race?
Those things, it's interesting there to compare Cuba to the US, because Cuba did have deliberative bodies. If Cuban leaders had listened to the American occupying force, the deliberative bodies would have been much smaller and less democratic than they ended up being. So obviously there were no women, right? Women couldn't hold office and vote in either place. But the U.S. tried to limit the franchise in Cuba by restricting it, in terms of property or literacy and things like that. And the Cubans actually wouldn't let them. And they said, in the elections that took place under the US occupation, they said, no, that would leave out most of the people who fought for independence. So, so basically, all the Americans would let them do was to expand it a little bit to property, literacy, or participation in the War of Independence, you know, like having membership in the Liberation Army. And so they voted in the initial ones. But then when the Cubans wrote their constitution, they did institute universal manhood suffrage. And it was effective and real, and Blacks ran for office and they voted, and they were parts of intricate patronage networks that that whites were also a part of. I forgot where I was going with that, but anyway, so yeah, so they did have deliberative, they did have deliberative bodies. So the answer is not there. I do think that part of what, I think there were two things that limited it, and one is race, as you said, because even though Blacks could participate, they could never, it was too difficult for them specifically, vocally, explicitly to attack racial inequality. Every time they did that, they were punished, right? Sometimes violently, as in the case of the race war of 1912. So I think, so I do think that race and racism served as a very important limiting factor on Cuban democracy. The other one, of course, was the US, right? There's no way to talk about Cuban democracy during the Republic without talking about the US. So when the US leaves, it leaves it insists that the Cubans adopt the Platt Amendment as an appendix to their constitution. The Platt Amendment gives the Americans the right to intervene, practically at will, and they do exercise it. And what that means is that Cuban politics always has to contend with what the Americans are going to do, and even the American military governor of Cuba at the time, Leonard Wood, in 1902, he's governor until 1902, when the Cubans accept the Platt Amendment, and they don't do so eagerly, right? That it's the Constitutional Convention. There are multiple votes on the Platt Amendment. They reject it almost unanimously the first time. It's closer the second time. And then finally they have to approve it because they know the Americans will never leave otherwise, right? Anyway, when they approve it, the governor of Cuba, the US governor of Cuba says, the Cubans have no practical sovereignty under the terms of the Platt Amendment. So that is another hugely important limiting factor on Cuban democracy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Guantanamo Naval Base is still,
which is also
2034. Is it? The lease runs out.
I don't even. Yeah,
I think 2034.
20. Okay, I think you said 1934, and I was like, no, but okay, that would make sense, right? Because it was in 1934 that it was renewed. So yeah, so 100 years, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So sovereignty is stifled by U.S. colonial meddling, and this can account for some of the difficulties of nation building.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Right. We've got a question from an alumnus of the José Marti Middle School of Miami. Daniel Moregas, he's a UVA graduate student, and he has a question to kind of move the conversation to a bit more contemporary aspects. And what would José Marti say about Cuba today? How much blame would he place on the US for their struggles?
José Marti was, I think, a brilliant man. He would condemn American imperialism in any form it appeared, and he would never deny that American imperialism is part of the story of how the Cuban Revolution unfolded. But he would not absolve the Cuban government for problems of its own making. And I think he would see the situation now, including the protests that happened in July, and he would blame the Cuban government, I think, much more than he would ever blame the U.S. embargo, for example.
Interesting. Yeah, this kind of tug of war over who can claim Martí,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
gives the approval for their particular program, whether it's the Cuban
Right.
government, you know, under whether Republican or revolutionary form, or whether
Right.
it's exiles or,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
or
Everyone,
protesters.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone claims him. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But you know, when I was saying before about, you know, so for those of you, I'm sure most of you know that there were protests in Cuba in July that happened at about, you know, 50 locations across the island. And it wasn't, you know, the people who came out in protest, many of them were Black, right? So there have been these, and if you've watched, actually, there's an amazing group in Cuba called Inventario, without the, but it's spelled differently. Can I put it in the chat? I'm going to send it to
Please.
you.
Yeah, I was going to ask if we could do that. Mhm.
Oh, I have to look at how it's spelled. I think they spell it without a lot of the vowels, and I don't remember, but it's basically Inventario without some of the vowels. But they did this video where you could see the protest. It has an interactive map, and you can click on the dots and see the protest in any of these dozens of places. And you can see that, not in all of them, but that there is significant Black participation. There certainly was in Havana, et cetera. And that's why, you know, some of the people speaking out against the protests have deployed this language that is like, why are those people protesting? They should be grateful for everything the revolution has given them. And it's the same kind of language that was used against the Black veterans after the wars of independence. They should be grateful because it was, you know, the independence movement that brought them into history and gave them freedom. In the revolutionary case, it's the revolution that brought them into full citizenship, right? And that demands loyalty, and that demands gratitude. And if you question it, then you're cast as, you know, ungrateful.
Yeah, you're the problem, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So just, you know, kind of another question that someone's brought up that kind of harkens back to those constituencies that we spoke about earlier, and how Martí addressed himself to, you know, to people, you know, groups with varying interests. And the question is, can you talk more about Martí's relationship to other Cuban exiles in New York City? Was that a place where he ran up against antagonisms to his visions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, he was very close to Tomás Estrada Palma, who became the first president of Cuba, and who did not act well as a you know, in relation to some of those Black Veterans Associations. So when the Black Veterans Associations would come to see him, actually, even before they were an association, when they were just, you know, Black veterans, and they would come to see him about this stuff, he was one of the ones who would deploy that language of, you're being divisive, you're being racist, this is inconvenient, and all that. So but Martí worked very closely with him. But Martí also worked really closely in New York, and the work of Jesse, there's a historian by the name of Jesse Hoffman-Garskoff who's done amazing work on this, you know, in New York City, about José Martí in New York City. He develops really close relationships with Black working class Cuban exiles. And he works really closely with them. For example, Rafael Serra is one of them, who was had been a tobacco worker, became a school teacher, and he started a school in New York City that was a school for Black workers, Black Caribbean workers from place, you know, Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, Cuba, etc. And José Martí used to teach at that. You know, he was so busy, and he was so struggling to survive as a writer and consul in New York, but he taught at that school every Thursday night, and he had a very close relationship with Rafael Serra, and one could argue, and Jesse suggests this, that it's partly Martí's interaction with that community that propels his vision of anti-racism. That he, you know, part of what propels it is his, you know, his own thinking and his own intelligence and his own sensitivity, or sensibilities rather. Part of it is seeing American racism up close, and part of it is also his interaction with Black and Puerto Rican Cubans in the city.
Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to use the time that we have left to kind of turn toward a more contemporary discussion about the contemporary relevance of Martí's thinking about the present and the future of democracy, both in Cuba and as well as in the US. And I'm wondering, like, as you've said before, Martí, he's in kind of in exile, I guess, in New York, or he's living, there in New York, and thinking about independence, and he's seeing, these bad examples in front of him, in the US, the crude essence of Jim Crow and this sort of thing. What can the US learn about democracy from José Martí?
Yeah, that's a great it's a great question. And in some ways, if you think about José Martí, growing up in a society that was basically, he was born in 1853, right? So Cuba was very much a slave society then. He witnessed the arrival of one illegal voyage from Africa, unload its human cargo, and he wrote about that really powerfully. So that is his background, that is his upbringing. And for him to consider all that and come up with these very eloquent treatises against against slavery, but against racial inequality, and to come up with these treatises in favor of racial unity and racial equality. I mean, on the one hand, how the people always say you have to judge people by the values of their times, right? Yes, but there are other, people can think differently, and people can arrive at other conclusions, and people can pursue democratic ideals in opposition to the values of their times as well. Like, people can be bolder in that regard. So that's one thing. I would say the basic one. So that's kind of on the side, but I think the most basic thing is that he made clear that there could be no true republic, no true democracy without that racial equality, right? And he really thought about how to make that real in the practice, and he worried about things that would challenge it, in the practice, in practice on the ground. So I think that's the main thing. I think that Martí can teach us, that the centrality and the core, the way in which that racial equality is at the core of democracy. Then one other thing he might teach us, because remember, and I do think it's important to remember, that Martí is an immigrant, right? And that immigrants sometimes have a privileged perspective on a place that we should be opening, that mainstream society should be open to listening to and to taking seriously, right? He saw things about American society precisely because he was an outsider. And that's, and I say that in the book, that part of, it's that whole idea of like looking at the US from the outside in, right? That I think it's good to see, for a country to see itself kind of from the view of other powers. I think Martí in his life and in his work modeled that kind of perspective. And that's part of what makes him such a valuable chronicler of American life. So I think that too, right? That American democracy, there, it's not just this insular thing. You have to think about it in relation to immigrants, in relation to the outside world, and the way the outside world interacts with the US and vice versa. So I think that's something else that Martí can teach us.
Okay, great. Can you say something about how you envision the intertwined futures of Cuba and the United States? You end your your book with the, the presidency of Joe Biden, he's coming in on the heels of Trump, and there's, policies are changed or not changed, what's the future look like between our two nations?
You're asking a historian what the future looks like. Yes, we love that question. So, well, I know this, that I don't know. One, at a basic level. And second, that I'm also really pessimistic about it right now. That, Biden had said that he was going to change the Trump policies, some of the Trump policies. He hasn't appeared, he hasn't done that, obviously. I don't think he's that committed to doing that. I think he's fine with the embargo. I think he's always been fine with the embargo. Ending the embargo was not part of the Democratic Party platform in 2020, even though it was in 2016 and 2012. So I don't think he was a particular fan. I think he was obviously open to the opening with Cuba, but I don't think he was that eager a fan of it, or that willing to spend political capital on it. That's my sense. So I don't think I can't see much change in that regard. And then in terms of what's going on in Cuba, I have, the Cuban government has reacted really badly to the protests that we saw this summer, arresting people, many of whom are still in jail. It's let some artists and intellectuals go recently if they leave the country. So some of them have had to leave the country in order to win their freedom, and even to win the freedom of a few other artists. Every time opposition figures, but not even opposition figures, not the right term I'm looking for, because what we've seen over the last year is that some of the people who came out in the protests, or some of the artists who came out last November and went to protest outside the Ministry of Culture, these are not like committed dissidents. They're people who there's a gamut of political positions. Some of them consider themselves part of a critical left. Some of them are more pro-US, but there's a real diversity there. But the government, when there have been calls for dialogue, not even for a change of government, for dialogue, to sit down and have people who are more critical and have artists have more access to get their information and their work out there. Because sorry, I'm rambling on a bit, but one of the things the new president did upon this is Díaz-Canel, upon taking office, was put in effect a decree that made it illegal for artists to display their work or to perform their work without express written permission from the Ministry of Culture. So that narrowed artistic and intellectual expression even more. It meant that all public art had to be, explicitly approved by the government. And artists have challenges, and they've asked for more openness. They wanted to, they asked for dialogue with the government about it. And at every turn, the government has quashed any idea of dialogue or negotiation, and referred to the people who ask it as like mercenaries or in the employ of the CIA, et cetera. So I'm also pessimistic about the Cuban government being willing to enact meaningful, constructive changes. So basically, I'm pessimistic both about both. And the economic situation in Cuba right now is terrible, and the COVID, I think it's maybe worse than this. I was there during the special period. That's when I did most of my dissertation research. I know how bad it was. I was seeing my family all the time. I saw how bad it was. People are saying it's worse than that. I haven't been back since November of 2019, so a few months before the pandemic started. But it just so it's not good. And I think the worse it gets, and the more entrenched the governments become, especially in this case, the Cuban government, I think the more possibility there is for violence, and that really worries me. And I worry that there are calls in the US for intervention, which I think would be a disaster. So So I'm not feeling too optimistic. Maybe that will change. But right now, you know, people are just really attached to their positions, and their positions tend to be very simple sometimes, you know, or simplified, I should say.
Yeah, right.
And often they're not that grounded in history, which I think is a shame. So
Yeah, I'm also hearing reports from my contacts on the island that conditions have worsened to at or worse than, you know, the time of the special period of the 1990s. So it's very dismaying, you know, to hear all this, you know. And are these young people who are, or they're primarily young people, I guess, not all, but who have been protesting this summer, have they been invoking Martí?
Well, I mean, the people who were chanting on the streets, I didn't hear any Martí, but of course I haven't watched all those like hundreds of videos on that site. I've watched a lot, but not all of them. They invoked a song that came out about a year ago called Patria y Vida, which is I think an ingenious work of art, right? Patria o Muerte was the government slogan, but you know, that was coined by Fidel Castro in 1960, which means fatherland or homeland or death, meaning if we don't have homeland, we would choose death. We would never, you know. And what this song does is invoke Patria y Vida. We want both homeland and life. So it's you know, it's an intuitively appealing argument. You know, why can't I have both life and a homeland? Right. And that song invokes Martí. So and it invokes Cuban history more generally. So which I think is interesting. And I was watching a video of one of the young people who was, and I've seen several instances like this. And this actually gave me cause for more optimism. So to maybe end on a more optimistic note, he was arrested after the protest, this playwright named Junior Garcia Aguilera, who is now calling for new protest on November 15th. But he did a video, they interviewed him, Periodismo de Barrio, which is kind of this independent media in Cuba that does very local reporting, interviewed him. And one of the things he talked about was when so many people were picked up that day of the protest. And he said that there were people in the cell together who would have never met otherwise. And that what they talked about was Cuban history. So they talked about Atue, you know, which is just, so that gave me that gave me a little reason for optimism, that people are interested in finding out like how we got here and where might we be going. Yeah.
Cuban history is so inspiring, and your book just makes it really come alive. And I really want to recommend to our audience that you pick up a copy of Cuba and American History. And I'd like to thank our guest, Professor Ada Ferrer, and also the Democracy Initiative for hosting this discussion. Please come back for future events. Thank you.